right, so before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and read a statement about our social media policy. We encourage healthy and productive conversations and appreciate the participation of a diverse community. We ask that comments remain on topic and offered respectfully. If folks do not follow collegial rules and behave with disrespect, we will exclude them from participating in this event and delete their messages from the chat. Disrespectful behavior includes name calling, threats, hate speech, attacks towards people's identities, harassments, insults, and insulting profanity. And yeah, I think we're good to go and get started if you're ready, Aisha. Okay, amazing. I'm really interested in hearing about your Hajj journey. And the first question is actually like, what does it mean to identify as a Muslim to you? And I think this would be a perfect way to connect your substance use to your Muslim identities. Do you want to go ahead and touch on?
I was going to talk about that when we talked about how my medicine work aligns with my Islamic identity, but thank you for having me and for talking with me today. So for me, my Muslim identity is really a diasporic identity because my grandparents fled from a small village in Gujarat in India to Pakistan during partition because of religious persecution. So for me, the religious identity is really linked to loss of home and migration. And there's many layers to loss of home. So that's very present for me. And then there's also, my Muslim identity is also a political identity for me. My family moved to the US in 1990. And after 9/11, even though we're naturalized, the permanence of our US home got called into question with the Patriot Act and with the rise of Islamophobia after 9/11. So the idea of having connection to a physical home or land has always felt very precarious for me. So my Muslim identity provides for me like a spiritual and emotional home in the absence of the stability of a physical home.
That's very sweet. It's like I remember sitting on a panel once. I was listening to someone speak and they said that psychedelics help them accept hugs from God. So it's almost like a home. And I like how you worded that. I'm sorry that you went through that. And thank you for sharing and feeling vulnerable enough to share that. And so when you went to Hajj, did you feel like that helped you a little bit with that feeling?
In terms of Hajj, I think as I got into medicine work, which for me is also linked to home. So working with people in expanded states is for me supporting people and coming home to themselves in a way. For some people that can mean cultivating a healthier relationship with yourself. For others, it's about reconnecting with a sense of creativity or with their wise self. So, and then I think about Islam and experiences of expansive experiences are a very crucial part of Islam for me. Because so many of the core practices such as fasting, the 5 daily prayers, and Hajj are about feeling connected to source and deepening relationship to all of creation. So I see several parallels between doing Hajj and going on a psychedelic journey. I like to call Hajj like the ultimate conscious expanding journey in Islam. Because Hajj is essentially a physical journey and it's also a psycho-spiritual journey. It involves traveling to an unfamiliar place, both externally and internally, so that you can access a deeper awareness of the divine and all of humanity. So I did Hajj when I was 23. And similarly to what I've experienced in psychedelic journeys, I experienced and sat with the whole range of emotions, from awe to grief to anger to apathy. To fear, like all of that came up during the pilgrimage because of the ways that the rituals are set up. So, and also Hajj, like a psychedelic journey, is a very embodied experience. So, one of the rituals is you circle around the Kaaba and, you're surrounded by millions of people and there's so much heat from the sun and pressure from all the bodies around you. And it's like physically taxing and hard. And there were like moments of fear that came up through that when when you experience that kind of crowding and you can't leave, which also sometimes comes up in a psychedelic journey. It's like, oh, well, I've taken the substance and now I'm just on this journey and I can't get off until it's done. Um, and same with, there's another ritual in Hajj where you stand on what's called the Mountain of Mercy or Mount Arafat, and it's the ritual where you stand all day in the sun and seek forgiveness. And again, that's a very taxing, physically taxing experience. Like you're very much in your body. You're standing, so you're feeling lots of sensations in your legs. It's very hot. Often people are fasting during that ritual, so you're also feeling a lot of hunger. Um, yeah, so I think there's many different ways that the Hajj rituals promote a connection to your body in a very intense and expansive way, which is what I feel happens in a psychedelic journey as well. Um, so all that to say that I think consciousness expansion is actually at the heart of Islam, that all the practices lead to that. And my work, which uses ritual and medicine to support people in healing through expanded states, also feels very aligned with that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I think experiences like without substances can still be psychedelic, quote unquote, or expanding your consciousness. Like breath work, for example, doesn't require psychedelics, but you're really still expanding your consciousness. And in the same way, I think practicing religion, not even just Islam, does that as well. And Hajj itself is a very disciplined experience. Fasting is a very disciplined experience. When you go to pray, it's a disciplined experience. You're doing it 5 times a day as a Muslim. And yeah, I feel like the experience itself has a lot to say, and that's amazing. And so you do amazing work with LGBTQ and underserved BIPOC communities. And I would love for you to talk about that because one of the pillars of Islam is charity. And I feel like it doesn't matter, it doesn't really have to be that you're donating money, but more of donating yourself and giving help. So I want you to talk about your work
Yeah,
because I think
so
it's beautiful.
yeah, I
And
agree.
I think
I
everybody would love to
think
hear about it.
I see zakat as yeah, it's not just a redistribution of wealth. I think there's a broader way to look at zakat, which is also giving of other resources such as time and energy. So and that's been a really core practice for me and my co-therapist. So I work with my co-therapist Jen Jones, and we we're really aware of this history that BIPOC and queer people have not historically been able to access psychedelic therapy. And it's really part of our value to make part of our values to make sure that people are able to access, especially as psychedelic is about to get very mainstreamed and medicalized. And even the medicalization of psychedelics creates a barrier, I think, for BIPOC and queer folks to access this medicine, partly because there's been such a long history of abuse and mistreatment in medical institutions for BIPOC and queer folks. So we think a lot about that, like what it means for psychedelic medicine to be accessible. So there's one layer of accessibility with how people, like where people are accessing treatment, but then there's also the financial aspect of it. So we never have not worked with someone because they couldn't pay us. It's really important for us to be able to provide the service regardless of someone's ability to pay. And what that has pushed us to do is to do really creative fundraising. But I think for it to be sustainable and in the long term, one of the most effective ways to do that would be for folks who are seeing wealthier clients, who are seeing white clients, who have more resources, to be able to fundraise with that group of people, to create basically a fund or some kind of resource for BIPOC and queer people to be able to access this work.
Yeah, and I think as this renaissance is developing, we really have to learn how to make it more accessible to everybody. And I think that's why like this series is important, and soon other series talking about other religions will be really important, because we want to expand the audience, we want to expand the community. And again, I'm really grateful that you're here talking to me about this, because it's really important information. And I'm curious about the substances that you use in your practice.
Yeah,
I think you
ketamine
mentioned it was
is
ketamine. Can you
really,
talk more about that?
I think it's a very safe medicine in terms of physically. It doesn't have some of the other risks that some of the other psychedelics do, and it's really useful for supporting people and working through trauma, through dependence on substances, for depression, for treatment-resistant depression. So it can be a really great way to introduce someone to doing this work, especially if they've never done a psychedelic journey before. Also, it's doesn't last as long as some of the other medicines. So it's a shorter experience, which can also make it more accessible for folks who can't take a lot of time off work. The recovery is shorter for ketamine. So again, like for people who can't take time off work, or who don't have access to childcare, or who don't have like 2 or 3 days to do this, they can still access medicine work and get a lot of relief and healing.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that ketamine is really helpful with trauma, and I think these communities, LGBTQ, BIPOC, and other communities, have experienced a lot of that trauma. And I think it's important, the work that you guys are doing with ketamine. And I'm curious to see how ketamine has helped you, if you've done ketamine, and how that's helped you with your Islamic identity or maybe your personal issues. Because I know a lot of Muslims use psychedelics for medicinal uses, and personally, that's how I use it.
Yeah, I think another aspect of ketamine is that it can help the constructs that are very rigid, that we hold, to be a little bit more malleable, so that we can have kind of a shift in perspective and see options when before we didn't see options in a particular area of our lives. So for me, partition has been a big part of my healing work. And I see a lot of potential for the application or for the use of ketamine in a place like Pakistan, where there's such a collective trauma that no one talks about. Like when I was growing up in Pakistan, you would hear little snippets about partition or like the histories that people had, but no one really talked about it in a like an intentional way, or really talking about the intergenerational impact of partition. So for me, the ketamine has been really useful in really kind of becoming aware of how that trauma has been sitting in my cells, in my body. One of the ways that it shows up is that, so my grandparents had to flee from India to Pakistan, which I mentioned earlier. And I think I've always had this sense of running, like I'm always running, I'm always working. Kind of, it shows up in like this workaholism. And the work with ketamine has really helped me identify what that is about. And like I'm a work in progress, so I'm still working through that, but it really has helped me change my relationship to work, and see that I'm using it as a distraction sometimes, or it's linked to fear that lives in my body. So work has been a way to soothe that fear, but I think because of my relationship to it, it's been really harmful for me as well. And ketamine has kind of helped me put all of that together. But I have to say, just one more thing, that the medicine journey is really important, but I really see that as like a catalyst. It's like an opening that can help people get insight. It helps me get insight. It can open up energy and motivation to then make the changes. But really, the real work is after journey. It's in the integration. It's in the day-to-day. So it's, and that's where Islam can come in too. Islamic practices like prayer, especially, can help create that meditative space, can help people stay connected to that expanded state. Because part of integration is finding ways to stay connected to that feeling of expansion. And prayer is a really great way to do that for some people. Um, so yeah, so there's a, you know, I feel like Islam has a lot of components that really could be supportive for people who are doing psychedelic work.
I think mentioning integration is such an important thing because I used to think, oh, I'm gonna do psilocybin and I'm gonna be perfect after that, and it maybe would last like a few days, the afterglow effect, but then it would kind of go away, and I was like, okay, well, how do I keep this feeling of gratitude? And it's really the integration. It's what you do before and it's what you do after your psychedelic trip. So it's not just taking the psychedelic itself; it's really doing the work on you. And in comparison, I think Islam is a great way to practice that integration portion of it. So my dad always tells me, or I think he's reminding me of this, that the poses that we do when we're praying namaz is very similar to yoga. When I do yoga, it's like child pose, it's like when we're in sajda, and it's good for your body, and it's almost like practicing mindfulness. And I feel like for me, God put these mindful activities here for me to practice. And I think in a way, after I do my psychedelics and I'm praying, I'm really integrating that in my body, and I love that. And you did mention something about generational trauma, and this is something that I also recently learned from a coworker, that generational trauma takes up to like 25 years to really cycle out of your body because of the epigenetics. So your ancestors' traumas are kind of being passed down to you, not even in a spiritual way, just scientifically, these genetics are just being passed down to you. So it's kind of like you may have your traumas and you may feel fine about yours, but there's a lot of healing you have to do for people like your mom, your grandma, your great grandma. And I think psychedelics can really help with that, and ketamine seems to really help with that as well. So I do want to touch on something else. I want to move the subject to drug literacy, because I think a lot of questions that I've been getting is that many people don't feel supported in their psychedelic use as a Muslim one. And at one point, maybe I felt like that. My parents have been so supportive throughout my whole entire journey, but it took some explaining to my grandparents, for example, because they didn't understand it. And once I sat down with them and I in-depth described it to them, they understood it and they accepted it. And I think that can help with a lot of traditional mindsets. So what is your aspect
Yeah,
on
I
the importance
see
of
drug literacy
and
as a
learning
part
about
of
that?
harm reduction. And why I love harm reduction is because it's a really effective approach to destigmatizing all drugs, not just psychedelics, but opiates, stimulants, all of it. And drug literacy is a really big part of harm reduction. It's about educating both the people who are using and the people who love them, who are around them. So, you know, when we talk about drug literacy and harm reduction, it's about knowing what effects and impacts the substances have on you, and the best ways to consume them for your circumstances, for your body. It's a lot of education around really understanding how the substance will interact with your body. And for folks who are not using, drug literacy is about helping people understand the differences between like a stimulant or an opiate, and also the reasons why people might be using those substances, and how kind of dependence on those substances happens and works, and what are the circumstances that create those dependencies, and shape the use. And unfortunately, because of criminalization, you know, what harm reduction kind of helps really drive the point home around is that criminalization is where a lot of the harm comes from the drug, that the drug itself is not inherently good or bad. It's the way that it's used, and it's the setting in which it's used. And if it's criminalized, it's much more likely to not be used as safely. Like people just don't have as many options to use safely. And that applies to psychedelics too. You know, the more stuff comes above ground, the more supports there can be for people to have healthier, better relationships with these substances. And I think another part of harm reduction that's really important for me is understanding that it's really important to develop a relationship with the substance, whether it's a psychedelic or an opiate or a stimulant, and figuring out how that relationship is going to support you. And also, it's a two-way relationship, you know, so it's also about how do we support that plant or that medicine also in existing in this world. Like if you take a broader view, you know, especially with opiates and, you know, looking at the ways that it's produced and how the people who are producing it are impacted. So I think all of that is encompassed by harm reduction, which is why I think it's a really beautiful approach to supporting the destigmatizing and of drugs in the Muslim world. And actually, there are Islamic countries that are using harm reduction, which is and using drug literacy already. Like there's a harm reduction programs in Malaysia and in Iran. I was reading that in the 50s in Iran, the government was handing out opium for a population of drug users who had been using for a long time, so that they would be less likely to buy drugs that were coming from outside of Iran. So there have, you know, harm reduction efforts have been around for a long time in the Muslim world. So I think as we're talking to people, to Muslim people, like there is a history there that you can draw from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, with talking about drug literacy and drug education, a lot of parents just want their children to be safe. And I want people to be safe as well. And I'm a strong advocate for harm reduction. I work with SSDP. We do a lot of Narcan workshops, fentanyl test strip workshops. And I mean, I can't even tell you the amount of students that have almost like taken fentanyl on accident. And at the end of the day, like I said, your parents just want you to know that you're safe. And after reassuring my parents that, hey, I properly educated myself on how to take these psychedelics and substances, and I was advised by a clinician and someone professional experience with it, they felt more at ease. And I think if we're able to offer that to more traditional mindsets, it might take weight off of the people that want to use psychedelics but can't because, you know, they have pressure from their parents or their grandparents or other loved ones or their Islamic community. And so I'm really curious on how we can expand that, but criminalization really takes a big part of that because, you know, it doesn't help seeing that these people are getting arrested for drug use. And I mean, parents can't help it but think, oh my gosh, like they must be terrible people if they're doing drugs, although they didn't do anything bad when they were on the drug. They just consumed the substance, which really isn't a crime. If anything, it's like their own body. And that's very interesting to me. So I'm curious on how you think that we can improve drug education in more traditional mindsets and how we can make it more accessible to them and educate people that don't really know too much about this.
I mean, I think a big thing I hear from Muslim parents is that, like, this misconception that you take a drug once and then your life is ruined. So I think some of that is literacy around, like, again, like how the drug impacts, like interacts with your body and like the long-term and short-term effects. And also like that it's different for depending on the class of drug that you're using. That, you know, it's harder to develop a dependence on some drugs versus others. All drugs can be therapeutic if, you know, used in the right context. Even a stimulant could be therapeutic if used in the right context. You know, like how many of us use Adderall when we need to get a paper done or pull an all-nighter? You know, there are safer ways to do this and to support your body while you're using that substance. So I think, yeah, I think a lot of it is just helping people kind of disentangle the fear from the drug, like, you know, kind of address this misconception that the one-time use or the single use like destroys your life. Like, what are they really, what is the fear there, and addressing that fear that parents or other folks are experiencing, elders are experiencing. And also, you know, bringing attention to like drug use is deeply happening in Islamic countries already. Like this is not something foreign. Like there are long cultures and histories of drug use in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in other Muslim countries, and that, you know, communities of people who use drugs have a lot of wisdom. So I would be really curious, like, what wisdom does the community of drug users, injecting drug users included, in Pakistan have? Like, what collective wisdom do they have around the substances that they're using, and using that to have these conversations? So I think the conversations also need to be localized, based on where the person is and what communities of drug users they're near or close to or connected with. So yeah, like I'll give you, oh, I was just gonna give an example. So I
Yeah, I
live
think
in
that sounds like a great
Kensington in
idea.
Philadelphia,
Go ahead,
which
I'm sorry.
is has a really long history of opiate use. Like there's a huge culture of huge culture and community of people who use opiates. And there's a lot of knowledge in the area of how to use opiates in safer ways and to minimize some of the harms. And that's been really important in my work as a harm reductionist in Philly, is understanding what people, what strategies people have developed in this neighborhood to stay safe for themselves.
Yeah, I think that also dives deep into how the government and just how healthcare also administers certain drugs, and that they're not themselves promoting safe drug use. I know for me, when I was in college and as an undergrad, I was told that I have ADHD. I had really bad healthcare at the time, and I wasn't really properly diagnosed. And so they immediately said that, oh, okay, we're going to put you on Adderall. But guess what? It's going to be fine because your CVS should have it because you live in a college town, meaning that they're giving Adderall to every student in my college town, which is very unsafe. It could be a very addictive drug, and people can abuse it if it's not used properly. And so, same way of like painkillers, people go get their wisdom teeth removed and they have like a 30-day supply of oxy, and it's way more than they actually need, and that's actually like encouraging addiction, and that can happen. And so it's really scary. Sometimes I think maybe the government is trying to make us do this, but how do you feel
think,
about how America
I
handles
mean,
that?
my my perspective is that it's not so much the prescribing that's the issue. It's the um, not having access to a safer supply of substances. So, you know, yes, like someone might get a prescription for a painkiller and then develop a dependence. Um, we don't really have great treatment programs for people. Most of them are not accessible anyway. Methadone programs are really hard to access. So, you know, I think what's needed is, one, better treatment programs, if that's what people want to do, but also looking at, you know, the drug supply in the US is poisoned at this point. So it's, you know, a lot of the drug supply has fentanyl in it, has what's called tranquilizer in it, which is a substance that is a veterinary medicine that's now added um, to the street-based opiates. And that, you know, people people don't even have the option to use any other opiate because that's what they can afford to buy. So for me, the answer is through making pharmaceutical grade medicines available to people who do develop a dependence, and then also having better treatment programs for people that are not punitive, that are not hard to get into, that are not financially prohibitive for folks. But I don't see the issue ultimately being in the prescribing at this point. Yeah.
I appreciate that perspective shift, and I kind of think differently of it now. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. I feel like maybe I was a little ignorant to
Oh,
it, but I
sorry.
really appreciate that. And I really hate to do this, but it's been 30 minutes already. It's literally been, I can't believe it. And I'm so sorry I've been cutting you short in any way, but we do have to close this up in just a minute. And I just want to thank you so much for offering your perspective and being vulnerable and offering your experiences. And I think the work that you do is amazing, and I hope that everybody looks you up and supports you. I'm gonna make sure this is recorded and uploaded to YouTube. That way you can view it, and anybody else in the chat that wants to view it can. So it'll be up on YouTube by tonight, and we are gonna close this up. So thank you so much,
Thank you
Aisha, for joining me
so
today. I
much for
really
having
appreciate
me.
you, and I hope the rest of your day is amazing. Yeah.